So Bridget Moix is the General Secretary of the Friends Committee on National Legislation. She is a PhD 2016 PhD recipient from the Carter School. And Antti Pentikäinen is a professor of practice, I think, at the Carter School. And they are going to talk to us about genocide prevention, but also talk a little bit about their work. So Bridget, if you can just really briefly introduce yourself, that would be great. And then I'll go to Antti also.
Sure. Hello, everyone. It's so nice to be with you. I'm Bridget. As David said, I serve as the General Secretary of an organization called Friends Committee on National Legislation. That means basically I'm the head of an organization that's a Quaker lobbying organization in Washington, D.C. And I can talk more about that as we are in conversation.
Thank you, Bridget. Antti?
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm professor of practice, which means that I don't have a PhD, but I've been working in the field. I worked about 25 years as a peace mediator, and I got pretty exhausted of that work. But then I was also quite curious to understand better why do these processes fail. So that brought me to Carter School, and especially looking into how trauma awareness can advise peace building, and neuroscience can advise why we do these things and how to get out of those cycles.
Thank you. I don't have a PhD either. I mean, we're a great field. We are very democratic. PhD, no PhD, you are welcome to come and work in our field, right? It's a wonderful thing about us. So Bridget, I'm going to start with you. If you can delve in a little bit more about the work that you do in the Friends Committee. And I'd also like you to talk a little bit about, once again, we're focusing on genocide prevention, talk a little bit about what that means. And I may pepper you with questions as we go through. So thank you.
Sure, great. Well, I will start with a little bit of background on FCNL, Friends Committee on National Legislation, and what we do, and then I'll talk specifically about genocide prevention and maybe some other things that I've done in my career related to that, just to help define what that means to work in atrocity prevention, genocide prevention. So FCNL is a Quaker lobbying organization. That means we advocate directly with Congress. We are registered lobbyists. We're the first religious lobbying organization established in the US. So we directly lobby Congress on issues of peace, justice, and environmental sustainability. And we do that directly in Washington, D.C., and also with a network around the country of advocates. We have advocacy teams. We have about 140 advocacy teams all across the country in 48 states. These are just small groups of ordinary folks who care about the issues that we work on and want to help change policy, want to move policy in Washington. And we focus a lot on building relationships with members of Congress and their staff, even if we disagree with them. So we try to put peace building into practice to walk the walk. And we find that that is actually the most effective way to change policy and to lobby for the things that you care about, is to build those relationships and engage with people over time, people who are making those decisions in Washington. So we work with a big network across the country. We advocate on a wide range of issues. So we work on both domestic issues and foreign policy issues. Our priorities, our legislative priorities, the issues we work on are set by a governing committee of folks from all around the country, Quakers and others, but really focus on issues that Quakers care about. That spectrum of issues includes everything from the budget, funding for social justice programs, funding for basic human needs programs. The child tax credit, for instance, was a big focus in our domestic programs. Also domestic issues like migration, supporting migrant services and funding for those services and programs. As well as issues like gun violence here in the US. We work on trying to prevent and end gun violence by supporting community-led violence interruption programs. So a wide range of domestic issues. And also related to genocide prevention, we have a longstanding Native American advocacy program. And Quakers have a long history of working in relationship with Native American communities. And we have an advocacy program that supports really trying to deal with the genocide that happened in our country and trying to reckon with and repair that by supporting Native American rights. So one of the issues, for instance, that we've worked a lot on over the past year is establishment of a Truth and Healing Commission on Indian boarding schools. And that, if you don't know the Indian boarding schools era, it's really part of the cultural genocide of the Native American communities that happened here in the US. Quakers were involved in it, so we have to do our own reckoning and repair work. And now the US has the opportunity to establish a Truth and Healing Commission for that. So that is one of the examples of working on genocide prevention, atrocity prevention, in the sense of addressing the past histories of genocide so that we can both repair and also prevent for the future. On the foreign policy side, there's more specific work related to genocide and atrocities prevention that we've been involved in, related to supporting federal funding for programs that really directly address atrocities and peace building to try to prevent genocide. So there are very specific funding accounts that are in the U.S. government budget. They support programs that the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, runs in terms of supporting community-based prevention of atrocities and genocide. Also, State Department has a specific fund called the Atrocities Prevention Fund. We advocate for the money there. So we have done a lot of work on these very specific accounts. The Complex Crisis Fund is another one. The Reconciliation Fund is another one. And a lot of work educating people about why should the government be investing? Why should we put our tax dollars into trying to prevent and respond and mitigate atrocities and genocide around the world? And then how do we get our government to actually invest the funds to do that and support making sure that those programs then reach really the people on the front lines, the communities that are directly living the realities of atrocities and genocide, places like Sudan, places like Gaza now, and trying to fund things like civilian protection there. So very specific programs in specific places that get funded through these accounts. So that's our part of our peace building program. We do a lot of other work on foreign policy and peace and war issues that I won't go into now, but the atrocity prevention piece is kind of part of that big portfolio. I was a lobbyist with FCNL for 10 years, so before being in this position. So I have worked within that policymaking framework of trying to advocate for better policies to prevent genocide for a number of years. I will say I never would define my career. I never tried to get into a career called genocide prevention or atrocity prevention. I care deeply about peace and was drawn to trying to figure out how can I contribute in some way to creating a more peaceful world. And the policy environment created openings where genocide prevention and atrocity prevention were more politically possible, let's say. We could make more advance by talking about genocide prevention and atrocity prevention because you can get people across the political spectrum to agree that nobody wants a genocide. And so then talking about that, and there were various steps in my career to get into this issue more, was a way of trying to prevent war and build peace in the longer term. Genocide, we know that genocides and mass atrocities occur over 90% of the time in the context of ongoing war and armed conflict. So these things are connected, and working on genocide prevention is a way of working on peace, and working to prevent war is a way to also work to prevent atrocities and genocide. So I really think of myself more in the spectrum of peace building, working on peace building, but I have kind of fallen into working on atrocity prevention and genocide prevention over the years. The other two things I'll just mention that I've done, and people can ask questions if you'd like, is in addition to lobbying Congress on these issues, I had the opportunity to work inside USAID for a couple of years in a fellowship program. Again, kind of fell into it, that allowed me to see how these funding mechanisms work and actually help move money to organizations that were working on the front lines in situations of atrocities. So 2013 to 2015, I worked at USAID. The crisis in the Central African Republic was unfolding at that time. And we were able to mobilize money through a fund called the Conflicts Crises Fund, which I had helped advocate for previously, to get down to organizations like Search for Common Ground and Mercy Corps and other local organizations that were doing the work of helping religious leaders intervene in the moments of crisis and de-escalate and prevent atrocities. So I was able to see that from the inside. I learned a lot working inside government, and there are jobs and parts of the US government dedicated to atrocity prevention if you want to go that route. And there's, a lot of opportunity to think about how to work on the inside of the system. And the last thing I'll say is I really care. My PhD at Carter School was about the role of local peace builders, the role of people really on the front lines and how to support them, because I do believe, and I have experienced, that the people who live through these situations are the ones who understand them best and have the best solutions. And international folks like myself, or folks in the international community, the best thing we can be doing is to be supporting their leadership and supporting them with the resources and the access and the things that they need to do the work they know is needed. So I worked for a number of years as the executive director of an organization called Peace Direct. And I'm now the chair of the board of the U.S. office, the executive director of the U.S. office of Peace Direct, I should say. And that organization is dedicated to supporting local peace builders who are on the front lines of atrocities and genocide. And one of the lessons I really took from a partner from Nigeria that I often say to people when you get into debates about what is genocide and how, defining genocide legally is really complicated. And we spend a lot of time on that. And he said, I don't care what you all want to call it. We want it to stop. We need your help to get it to stop. And so thinking about, what can any of us do who care about these issues? How can we play a role? What are you led to do, and where do you find an entree point? I'm going to put in the chat 2 links, FCNL's overall link for our organization, and then our young adult program. I'll also put a link which has opportunities right now. Actually, we have a program assistant, year-long program assistantship that starts next academic year, but the applications are open now. It's how I started after college, and we have some other opportunities there that I'll let you look at. And I'll stop there.
One of the things you mentioned before we talked is the Elie Wiesel legislation. So one of the things is that
Sure.
In an era where there's a lot of political tension, people on the left and the right, the blue and the red, can still come together, right? And that was an example.
Absolutely, yes. So we've been talking a lot to people who are really concerned about a second Trump administration and what that means for a very wide range of issues. And one of the stories we've been telling people is about passage of a bill called the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocities Prevention Act, which was passed in a bipartisan manner by Congress during the Trump administration, and which President Trump signed into law. And that bill, we worked on that bill for many years. It takes a lot of time to get to actually having legislation. But that bill passed, and there are parts of it that continue to be implemented. It requires the US government to assess atrocity risks and then to actively work to respond to them. It authorizes some of the funding I talked about. So it puts into place a number of mechanisms within the US government that didn't exist before. So it's a good story.
One last question, Bridget. What do you find most rewarding about your work?
Oh, that's great. Yes. So what I find most rewarding about my work is that I get to work in community with a lot of people. I get to work in community with people who are living through some really horrendous experiences of war and violence and atrocities, and who are committed to working for peace. And that's incredibly inspiring and gives me a sense of real responsibility, given my privilege and ability to access power in Washington and help other people access that power. So I'm really inspired by those folks. And then I get to work with folks around the US. We have a lot of young adults who come through our young adult program. We also have a lot of people from the Quaker community who've been doing this work for 30, 40, 50 years. And that network of people who show up to do the work, not because they're getting paid like I am in a job, but just because they care so much about these issues that they want to be part of helping change that, you know, to build a more peaceful world, that just continues to inspire me.
Thank you. Thank you, Bridget. Antti.
Yeah, thank you, David, for bringing me in the same call with Bridget. I've noticed her holding space really nicely for herself and other people and the topics she works on. So it gave me many other reasons to reach out to her and try to meet here in DC. So thank you for having me here. I also feel like her that I'm not necessarily a specialist on genocide prevention, but I've been dealing with the issue, of course, and so including being advisor for the UN advisor on the genocide prevention, which took me to Kigali just a couple of weeks to a meeting where we were discussing two documents. One was about using mediation and dialogue as part of genocide prevention, and then on ethnicity and genocide, and let just giving a little bit of background and context. So UN has this office that was established after the Srebrenica massacre, genocide in Bosnia, and the Rwanda genocide. And it feels like it was some kind of feeling of be reviewed and assessed and advice could be given. But it's also a very broken system because the office itself doesn't have resources. It has to fundraise through projects. And then the special advisor only has a mandate to advise. And clearly it tells the advisor not to determine whether there is a genocide or not. So it's a really hard job to do when you're having to what's going on and provide advice, but you're not actually allowed to call on these things happening. And so yeah, in Kigali, it was also very painful to be, because at the memorial, there was about 250,000 people buried underground. And so it's a very heavy place to be spending a week. And so I'll share a little bit later on a couple of thoughts that were really going through my mind, and that could be a reflection for you guys to think about this. But first of all, I was very surprised to learn about Gregory Stanton. David, you must know him much better than I do. But Gregory used to be a professor at the Carter School, and he's really the guy to look to what to do in genocide prevention and stopping genocide. His story is super touching because he went on a development humanitarian mission to Cambodia and saw how what was happening and the incredible amount of violence that was still going on. And he tried to launch, through lobbying State Department, a tribunal. But once that didn't happen, he was able to initiate a national tribunal against the Khmer Rouge regime. And so when somebody who really has the conscious and awareness that something has to be done and can be done does those things, but eventually also has to pay a heavy price, because these kind of people are not always appreciated within the system, it's very touching. So if you do want to explore a life journey, Gregory Stanton, and being affiliated also with Carter School is somebody. And then we have Dr. Erickson, who's a professor who teaches. The question I've really been thinking over the years is like, what really happens when somebody who is has survived a genocide can also become a genocidal in terms of their thinking and their action. And so it's also like a question that's highly relevant today. When we were in Kigali, we were trying to analyze what has happened since Srebrenica and Rwanda, but also some genocides before, like let's say the genocide of indigenous people in Guatemala in 82 and 83, which happened after US really heavily intervening on an elected government that they felt was communist, and instigating a military coup, and then training the military and the paramilitaries, the practices that they were actually exercising when attacking the indigenous communities. About 640 villages were burned and people were tortured and killed with great numbers. I don't think there's ever been a discussion in this country what to do about that legacy. And so we're living in an era where after 30 years, the never again statement has become a genocide denialism in our time. And this also relates to the reality of what Bridget mentioned about the Native American, the Indian boarding schools. Like there isn't a reference, and I used the same reference as you did, Bridget, when I was helping as our Finnish Prime Minister Special to launch our Truth and Reconciliation Commission with our indigenous people in Finland. I spoke about culture genocide, but there it says explicitly that if you steal children and put them away from their parents, that is an act of genocide. So there's kind of a whitewashing from Canada to start to use this term of cultural genocide, which tries to pretend that they weren't actually executing a genocide, while the convention says that it actually was genocide. If you go and put a law and steal every possible child from their parents to take away their culture and identity and destroy who they are, it is an act of genocide. But that's just another example how we're living a time of genocide denialism. And the second big question I'm thinking is that what has made our culture so insensitive of these most brutal acts of violence against other human beings? Like, we're really living a time where there's been a genocide on top of genocide, and we're living in a culture and a time where the genocide denialism is actually the predominant thinking, not genuine acts to prevent it, to make it never happen again. And here I'm looking also to the history of churches, which is also related to Quakers being involved with managing these boarding schools. I think 90% of them were run by churches, but that just didn't happen from somewhere. The Europeans who came here were many fleeing genocide, religious persecution, but that also has a history. So something in the church as a whole has made it very vulnerable for abuse of violence. And it's really heartbreaking to see when the church had its first chance to execute violence to immediately study the internal dissidents and burn books. And equally, it's very interesting to see what happened between the first and the second temple in Judaism. Like when certain kind of power is being executed and certain kind of principle being established, where does that leave that tradition in terms of vulnerability for future genocides is something that I'm just super curious and interested to understand. And I'll pause here, David. I saw you unmuting, so do you have a question here?
Yeah, one of the things that strikes me about genocide is that if you were to ask Americans, right? I mean, one of this is, our job is not as only to work as a community to prevent, but to educate Americans. And I were to say genocide, okay, Holocaust comes to mind. Harder to make the case with a lot of Americans about Native Americans, but it is true. Armenian genocide, but very few Americans. Cambodian, very few Americans know about that. And then we're talking about these subtle genocides. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's like, separating children from their families. I mean, I think about Russia forcing into adoption and giving them new names and that kind of thing, which has the characteristic of a genocide. Is that how do we make the case to Americans, we would say, and I mean international, about what a genocide is and how do we, why it's important for us to work against it. And, Bridget, you can chime in there too, because I think this is one of the challenges of genocide prevention work is that people can't get their hands around it, or they get their hands around it in one context. Antti, tell me
No,
first.
true.
Bridget, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think like this is at the core of the problem here in the US, that I don't think there's a way for the US democracy to survive and this polarization to just go away without becoming honest and addressing what the past is, while the process has to be inclusive and invitational. Like, very rarely can you force somebody who has been causing the harm recognize what they have done and change if it goes to just litigation. Sometimes the litigation is necessary to get a process going, but there has to be an invitational process for those who have caused the harm or continue to cause the harm by looking the other way or accepting the systemic problems that continue to be existing recognize, because if you don't find that space, they will only find another way to continue to cause the harm, and that's what I think this country has been really suffering from. So, but what I wanted to put the context is here is that we're not dealing with something that.
I think you froze, Antti. Bridget, why don't you chime in, and then we'll pick up on when he gets back in. Yeah.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it is, there's a huge amount of educational work that needs to happen in the US and globally. And I think we can get ourselves stuck in definitional arguments when we try to say, well, we want to make sure we're talking about genocide, and not there's a long history that we know genocides don't get defined as genocides until long after the killing had began and maybe even has stopped. And so I think we did a lot of work, for instance, when I worked at USAID, in trying to help reframe things as, mass atrocities and talking about atrocities to help people break out of this feeling that genocide was this very, special thing that was so unique that it couldn't have happened anywhere else. And the discussion right now in the United States among many students and on the streets over the past year has been about Gaza. And many people are saying this is genocide. I mean, this is an ongoing conversation in my organization as well. Name it, 44,000 people being killed, most of them civilians, many of them children, very intentionally. Why are we not calling this? Why is everyone not calling this genocide? And then you get into these definitional arguments about intention and how you define genocide, and Hamas also having the intention of wiping out Israel. And you can get stuck in this conversation about definitions that I don't think helps us do what we're trying to do.
No,
right?
I mean,
And
the ICC charging Netanyahu and everything, once again puts it in this little box. It's got to fall.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But I think one of the things that helps when you talk about genocide prevention is you can say, let's not discuss whether it is or is not happening right now. We know we want to prevent it. And let's talk about what are the steps that are needed to try to prevent this violence from escalating further, from continuing, and how do we de-escalate it? And so then, that is, I think, there's a strength in talking about genocide prevention as a field in that it gets your attention. And it gets political support across a wide spectrum, more than, say, peace building, which people don't know what is, and it's really hard to explain. But what I think we need to do is get the attention and then talk about the broader spectrum of work that needs to happen to de-escalate, prevent, mitigate, rebuild. And there was a hand up I saw, so I want to.
But I want to let Antti finish up, and then I'll go to questions.
Yes, great.
Jamal has a question, but Antti, did you want to add anything else?
No, I mean, we're having twice electricity went down. I shifted to my phone, and then it went back to 5G. So I guess this is a third world problem here in Arlington. But yeah, no, I'm happy to talk later a little bit about kind of what really is gratifying for me in this work, as you wanted us to share that. But I think we can stay in this topic.
But tell us what's gratifying. Let's do that in case we'd never get to it, because I do want to hear what's gratifying about you, the work. Then we'll go to questions.
Yeah, so I'll actually wanting to share a picture.
Oh, I see it. Yes, I do.
Yeah, so this is a picture we took. I took in Kigali at the memorial, and they have a village of reconciliation and forgiveness, and a few of the people who lived there came. And this gentleman on the left, he was hacked with machetes during the genocide, so that he went to coma. And the Rwandan rebels, the Tutsi rebels, just came in time to find out him amidst of the bodies that he was still breathing and alive, and he was, I think, several months in coma before he woke up after the genocide. And he stayed in the rehabilitation for, I think, 9 years. And but then he was told to go back to his village, and he said, "I'm not going to go there. They're going to kill me." And he lived in waste dumps, living from food scraps, and until somebody heard about him and they brought him to the village, and he saw that there was a real house and wanted to stay. The real story of him is that the lady that he's standing with this is his wife, but she's also the daughter of the man who killed his entire family. And they're not only living together and having children, but he's also taken his in-laws to live in the house, and he's helped them to repay the reparations that they were indicted to do through the Cachacha courts. And you cannot do that if you haven't genuinely moved beyond that pain and have been able to find some healing and forgiveness. And so like you said, if I would not be in my house, my kids would share my story equally, exactly as I would share. So they're not hiding the story, they're not hiding the pain. And for him, the defining moment was when a bishop was speaking about how if you don't forgive, you will not be forgiven. If you don't ask for forgiveness, you will not be forgiven. And so there's kind of a spiritual guidance that he received and then took personally and somehow looked into himself and chose to start that really long and difficult path of forgiveness. But it's obviously been a very long journey to be able to live with the perpetrators under your house and having children. With the daughter of who killed his whole family. So it's just absolutely, it seems like impossible, and you cannot hide that was true to him. And if this is possible for him, it's possible for humanity. And I'm just so grateful to be able to be in the presence of that kind of people. So
That is incredible, and it really shows the capacity for forgiveness and how we all have that. It's just not something that we all can find, but it's there if we can work at it. Let's take some questions now if we can. I know Jamal, you had a question, and then I think you put your hand down. Jamal, you still there? You want to ask a question? It's
Yeah,
always nice to
here.
see you.
Sorry about the
Oh,
delay.
and you
Uh,
want to ask Bridget or Auntie, both, either? You just throw it out there.
I, well, now well, my question was more indirectly in response to kind of the definitions of genocide. It's something that Dr. Doug the Irving mentioned because we took the class with him. That's something he like kind of attacked. It's just like, yeah, this definition is almost like a stall tactic because it is so nuanced and legal heavy. And it's becoming a question for me as I continue to think about like a career in this is like, do I need to really have like an understanding of comprehensive law in order to make any form of like impact in this? But also, I guess since you've already mentioned that, well, both of you mentioned that you don't necessarily need a doctor to do this work. Um, I don't know. I guess now my question is just what is the most effective way to educate where you are? Because maybe you are in a lobbying position, maybe you're not. My background is entirely education. It's been like teaching all age groups, and I kind of stumbled into this program just by I don't know, following my soul. It just led me here. But I don't really know like where the best use of this knowledge will be now. Like I'm finishing up at least a certificate now, but I'm not entirely sure how to best apply it in the day-to-day spaces. So I guess if you could, either of you, any of you could give context for that, I guess I'd appreciate it.
All right, Bridget, Auntie, go ahead.
Sure. Well, I'll jump in first and just to say thank you for being an educator. Y'all are my heroes. I don't know how educators. I'm good with advocacy. I have two kids. They're teenagers. People who are educators are heroes to me. And I do think I don't think there's any like job track, right? And I think it sounds like you're doing exactly what is always the advice when people ask me, how do you get in a career? Like follow where your soul is leading you, follow where you feel led to contribute your gifts. Education in this country about these issues, about the history of our own country, that is like a tinderbox right now. That is where like the future for our kids and how we're going to live together in this country and how we're going to be a country in the world is going to play out. So, I think I didn't learn growing up. I didn't have an education. I had pretty mainstream education. I grew up in Ohio, went to Catholic school. I had basically a racist education. I mean, I didn't have the kind of learning that, thankfully my kids are getting more of now where they are. But we really need to grapple with understanding our own history as a country, as Auntie said, before we can think we're going to contribute, to the world more broadly. I think that's at real risk right now. The Indian boarding schools work is so important, but it's just this tiny window. It's just that literally the boarding schools era. But it's like, well, if we could have a Truth and Healing Commission on that in our country and really start educating people about what's, the history of this country really has been, you can open it up and have more conversations. So I just want to say, I think, education is critically important. And you can do this kind of work in a lot of different fields, a lot of different ways. You can be a lawyer, and legal work is important. Direct services work, direct work with communities that are in the midst of or facing violence is really important work. Education is really important work. So it's kind of like, how do you take the learning and the lessons and think about, well, here's how I can apply them in the pathway that that you feel drawn to. I think something like the Holocaust Museum and as an educational institution is very influential in a lot of ways, but we don't have nearly enough of those kind of institutions and educational ways of teaching all of us, not just kids, teaching all of us about these issues and how we can contribute to them in our lives. And the last thing I'll say is genocide depends on a lot of people participating. For mass atrocities to unfold, genocide to unfold anywhere, it depends on a lot of people just going along. And so one of the lessons that an organization in Rwanda, which I'm forgetting the name of right now, but I saw a presentation by them about the work they do post-genocide in Rwanda. And the most important thing they think needs to be taught is critical thinking. Beyond, teaching about ethnicity, the ethnic history, the realities, colonialism in Rwanda, whatever you want to, or the genocide itself, critical thinking so that people can question when they're asked to do something that is, gonna go against basic morals or something. So there's a lot of ways. I don't think I answered your question very well, but it sounds like you're doing really good work already. And just, I would say, take what you're learning and apply it to what you already love to do.
Antti, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, Jamal, I couldn't more agree with Bridget when she framed kind of her approach to what you do and who you are and kind of your soul, your spirit guiding you, which way to go. The couple things that I'm personally focusing on, and I'll just share that, but one is just making people like me understand that the Western hegemony is based on a genocide on top of genocide, and the denialism is in a very deep way who we are and how we exist in this world. And so I'm not holding a speech or having intervention without coming back to that, but then also taking it deeper, like when the popes did the doctrine of discovery in 1100, authorizing and blessing people who were non-Christian to be killed, basically genocide after genocide again on indigenous people. It came after 700 years of internal persecution within the church. And just last year, the Pope said that this was actually wrong. So we're very short of recognizing what the level of harm has been, and just thinking about how our economical system, the capitalist system, is based on the same intention of taking whatever is out there and abuse it for your own benefit. And so for our entire survival as humanity is dependent on our ability to be aware what took us here. The second thing is the gentleness. You can end up easily in a very quickly nasty arguments about this, but how is it that we can be aware and lead and show what the process is where we recognize our humanity and our interdependence, and so that's the beauty and that's the difficulty, which you have to do probably as an educator every day, and you may have more skills than I do on it. So, but that's like the stories I shared from Rwanda, that if after what has happened, that's possible, it has to be possible elsewhere, even though the paths might be very different.
Thank you, Antti. Ella, you have a question, please.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. My question was really for both of you. I'm currently studying in Malta for GMU, and one thing we've been discussing a lot is the impunity of the international community when it comes to genocide and crimes against humanity. And I would love to hear how, through your work, you think you've been able to address this level of impunity, at least for, a term of punishment for those who've committed crime, but also with the lack of impunity, how have you seen people, kind of the story you told, go through that healing trauma process, and how you've been able to interact or use your skills to address that? Because I don't see, sadly, this being addressed, especially in this landscape of those committing the crimes kind of being punished for their actions. But I would love to know how we as practitioners can work towards guiding people or helping people towards that healing or educational phase so we can address genocide on the back end and hopefully before it happens again.
I'll probably go first.
Let me acknowledge first, Ella, thank you for coming in from Malta. What time is it in Malta?
6:45, I'm actually cooking my dinner.
I know we have another student in Japan. It just shows you what we can do in this way. So Antti, you're going to go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'll go quickly and then I'll post some video links on the chat that you guys could watch. But it's a really good question, and I think that's why, we have to accept and be aware that this kind of hegemony where justice is selective cannot really sustain itself without changing. And I think the pressures we will be seeing on ICC in the next term, the US presidential term, will just prove how imperfect the systems are that we have set up. Like Gregory Stanton really worked hard to get US into their own statute, and then got US in, and then Bush got us out. So that work is still ongoing. But I'll just speak it from the kind of the Sierra Leonean perspective. So Bridget also knows the Fumble Talk community level efforts there. So the outcome of after the Civil War was that they had an international criminal court, special court in Sierra Leone that indicted 9 individuals, and it cost 300 million. And then they had a National Truth and Reconciliation Commission that had to finish its report. I think in 2 years, it really never had time to go to villages, just kind of the regional capitals. And so there was never nothing for the people, ordinary people in the villages. And however, that's where the child soldiers went who had done the atrocities. And so that's when the idea of Fumble Talk came from John Cocker, who had been a human rights defender. And so how do you deal with that when your neighbor has basically been slaughtering your family, is living there, and you have to live side by side? And they came up with this village-based process, which, looks scary in the beginning. They have bonfires, and a victim can share what happened to them. And if the perpetrator is there, they pull it in the front and ask them to share why they did it. But obviously, there's a lot of preparation for it. And so what I saw was a genuine happiness in these villages. They were still continuing this model where they were speaking about the lack of trust or family issues, even today, after so many years, after 17, 18 years after the Civil War ended. And so there's still a way of dealing with a lot of issues, and they had governance around it. And then they have reconciliation committees, and they had also acts of reparation. So if you had hit somebody and cut somebody's hand, a potential reparation was that you would work on their field to make sure that they have food for their whole lives. So it was not just left for the apology at the bonfire, but there was no justice available outside, people addressing themselves, what is going on. So it's not something somebody can determine for anybody, but it has to come very genuinely through the involvement of the survivors.
Bridget?
Yeah, I would agree with everything Antti just said. And, I think there is not enough support for that locally led approach of what is justice and accountability gonna look like. And so I think we need a lot more of that. I'll just say on the sort of advocacy side and accountability side, as an organization, working with an organization that works on US policy, I mean, what we know is that the victors are the ones who write the history and get to decide what does accountability look like. That's the sad truth of our system, our international system, the UN system, the US policy itself. is never been accountable for the abuses and crimes and violations of international law and genocide and atrocities that the victors and the colonial powers and the, the P5 have been perpetrating. And I think that part of what's happening now is that international system, that impunity and that dissidence is breaking down. And we don't know what's going to come next. The international system that we have right now is constructed from an era that's gone, and it was constructed in a power structure that was biased and that needs to change. But we don't know what a next change is going to look like. And I think it is people like you all and others who are coming into these fields and asking these questions that can help figure out, how do we get to greater justice in the international system? How do we actually get to a system where there is human rights for all, and that there is accountability for all? We've been working a lot on trying to address U.S. impunity in the mass atrocities in Gaza right now. And it took so much effort just to get a vote. The U.S. sends $3 billion worth of military aid to Israel every year. Since October 7th, they've been pouring more weapons in. The administration has sent a lot of weapons in under the threshold where they don't even have to tell Congress and authorize the transfer of these weapons. And we know those weapons are being used in violation of international law and are killing civilians. We know that. It's taken enormous effort just to finally get to some votes in the last month, where Senator Sanders introduced votes to halt a few of the specific offensive weapons transfers that the U.S. was doing. 19 senators did vote to halt some of those weapons. And that was actually a historic vote because it's never been questioned. The U.S. military support to Israel just was untouchable. And so the amount of advocacy and effort it takes to address these issues of impunity is huge, and it's real. And I think there's nobody but those of us as a U.S. citizen, I just feel a real responsibility to say, that's my work, to help prevent atrocities. I've got to hold my government accountable because the international system is not able to do it. And so I do think people, in the US, in Europe, in the countries that have the greatest amount of power in the international system, and therefore often the greatest, lack of accountability, we as citizens in those countries have a really important role to try to advocate and increase accountability. So, addressing U.S. complicity in many places in the world, in many situations, and here in our own country, I feel like is part of the atrocities prevention work that I should be doing. So,
you, Bridget and Antti. Another question. Just raise your hand or open your mic. There was a question in the chat. Farzana, did you want to pose your question, or you just want me to read it?
It wasn't a question, it was more of a comment
Okay.
that I made regarding, these are conversations that I have just with regular people, right? Not people involved in politics and such, more people who just kind of watch the news and superficially listen to things. So it was way back in the beginning of this session here, but the topic about genocide and Holocaust, et cetera, is the standard that people are using is World War II and the magnitude of the numbers. And so they will frequently say, well, what's happening in Gaza, doesn't qualify because it doesn't reach this insane magnitude of threshold. They don't really understand, and I keep saying it's about intent, it's not about the numbers. So that's the only point I was trying to make. But I do have maybe a question now, which is that if you are, there seem to be a lot of different ways, and it can get very overwhelming and confusing for some of us, how to get more involved directly with the kinds of things like, you know, Bridget, that you were doing, and Antti, but, you know, wanting to impact legislational change, you know, like really as, you know, do you join a grassroots organization? Do you join a lobby group? Like, what's the most direct sort of way, if that's not kind of oversimplifying the issue?
Thank you, Farzana. We've got about 6 minutes left, so I want to get this question in, and then Fernando has a question, then we may call today. But go ahead, Bridget. No, go, Bridget. You're on mute.
Sorry, I'll be very brief. We'd love you to get involved with FCNL. You know, what we do is help people learn how to advocate. We have advocacy teams around the country. We are starting campus chapters if Carter School wants to start a campus chapter. And the links I put in, we you know, have an advocacy core. We have a number of different ways that you can get involved. And so we're one option. There are, as you say, a lot of organizations. So finding the one that speaks to you most, and you know, just putting some time into it is a wonderful thing to do.
Antti?
No, I agree. Join one of these meetings of Bridget or Quaker meeting. It's a good way. Yeah, to get more information. Yeah.
All right, Fernando, I'm giving you the last question. Fernando's in Japan. So we've had Malta and Japan. So Fernando.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that amazing presentation, both of you, really, for the work that you're doing and the commitment. It's inspiring for those of us who are trying to make a difference, and like then you see that this is how you make it. So thank you very much for sharing your points. My question has to do with, I work a lot with university social responsibility and how universities engage for social change. Obviously, our field has a lot to do with this. And one of the things I like what you said, what you mentioned about the denial of genocide or the denial of altogether. And Bridget, I just love what you said about the US kind of not seeing what the US is doing outside of the US. You used a word, and I can't pick it up, but you used the one word that I'm like, yes, that's exactly it. And one thing that I noticed is that the US, I have strong connections to the US, but people in the US don't see it. Like the one thing I see is that people are not aware of the impact the US has outside of the US. So I can't remember the word, it's something like the complicity or something. You used a word like that. So my question to you is, because I work with social responsibility at the university level, we as academics have a role, and I think that we kind of know, in our field, we kind of know what we want or how we can contribute. But my question is, do you think that we have the power to create a movement among universities that go beyond our field, and we can bring in more people to become aware of this? And if this movement is possible, how could we enhance it? How we could, I think it has already started, but it needs more, the sparkle is there, but it needs boom. So how can we bring that? I think that Antti, when you shared the documentaries, that's an option. But how do we bring more, and how can the universities as a whole be part of this? Thank you.
Antti, you're faculty. Do you want to answer first?
No, I think, Fernando, you answered it yourself very much already, and you're doing it already. And I can sense that I'm like I became in the GNU a career connector faculty fellow. So I'm trying to think how the faculty can help the students to their careers. And one of my proposals is to talk about like Mason dreaming. Like, what are the dreams of our students, how they want to change the world, and then asking the faculty that what is it that you can do to help that dream to become true. It reminds me of a conversation when I was in South Sudan in a school that was built on the name of our former president, Nobel Peace Prize laureate Ahtisaari. And there was a girl, 13-year-old, and she said, I want to be the president of South Sudan. And I was just thinking first to myself, you're likely going to be married by your father, going to have kids in a couple of years. You'll not be able to finish her school. And then I said to myself, no, pause here. Ask the dad to come and ask the dad, does he know her dream, and what can he do to make that dream to become true? So I think that's it. Those kind of things really matter. But thank you, everybody. I'm sorry I have to leave.
I know, Auntie, you have to leave. Bridget, I'll let you have the last word on this, and then we'll call it a day.
Yeah, I would just say yes. I want to say yes. I think universities, academia is really important in helping build a movement and growing the power for movements of change, positive change. I know for me, going to college and being like, that's when many people you see beyond your world. And a lot of people in the US, if you look at, who is voting for Trump, say, and who's asking for change, positive change, it's education is a big factor. So I think universities have such an important role. It's a real privilege to be in a space where you have time to learn and to think and to interact with diverse people who have different experiences and grapple with these issues. And it's such an important place for change. So it's one of the reasons as we're trying to build our network, we're really trying to think about campus engagement as a really important part of building that movement.
Well, thank you, Bridget. And thank you, Auntie, who had to step out. Bridget, could you put your contact information in the chat also if students want to reach out? So thank you all today for being here. It's the last one of the semester. I wish you all a pleasant December and January. For whatever holiday you celebrate, have a happy one. Happy New Year. Good luck with the end of the semester. Those of you who are finishing up. My own students who are in the room, you are done with me for the semester. But other students I know are still working on things. And thank you, Bridget.